This is Unit 4B, Part 1. Okay, well, as we discussed before, the hypothalamus, which is located in the diencephalon of the brain, projects neural tissues down, neural axons down into the through the infundibulum into the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and in the hypothalamus you get synthesis of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin. Those two hormones are synthesized there and then exported down the infundibulum into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, where they're stored. As you know from what we did in renal physiology, antidiuretic hormone will prevent diuresis, or loss of water. So you get, with release of ADH, you have an increased reabsorption of water from the filtrate in the kidneys. This typically occurs with hypovolemia, dehydration, low blood pressure, things like that. The other hormone, oxytocin, acts to stimulate smooth muscle contraction in two particular tissues, obviously in females, the breasts and the uterus. Okay, so the way oxytocin works is that it has a positive, it works through a positive feedback mechanism. Now we're just talking about the uterus, but in general it works through a positive feedback mechanism where the release of a small amount of oxytocin will trigger uterine contractions. And this, of course, occurs in a full-term pregnancy. After 9 months, there's some release of oxytocin. It triggers uterine contractions, and uterine contractions themselves will trigger more oxytocin release. And more that's the positive feedback. And more oxytocin release will cause more intense uterine contractions, and it all escalates till the baby's delivered. And for that reason, labor can be induced in a full-term pregnant woman by injection of a small amount of oxytocin. So exogenous delivery, or external delivery of a small amount of oxytocin, will stimulate that positive feedback loop and result in delivery. The other thing oxytocin does is it triggers letdown reflex. So the stimulus of hearing, of suckling of the baby on the nipple, or even hearing a baby cry, will trigger will trigger oxytocin release, causing a contraction of smooth muscle within the breasts, resulting in release of milk. It also has, and there is some controversy, but it has apparently a role in sexual arousal and feelings of satisfaction in males and non-lactating females. In terms of the other hormone that the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland stores, antidiuretic hormone, it will regulate and water levels in the tissues, prevent dehydration, or it can regulate water overload. Reduction of antidiuretic hormone occurs during water overload. It will reduce the volume of urine in general, it causes a reduction in volume of urine. So, in other words, a reduction in the amount of water that gets out or is lost or released in the urine. The whole thing is monitored, the whole situation is regulated or monitored through osmoreceptors. These are receptors in the kidney that monitor the osmolarity or osmolality of the solute concentration in blood, and will monitor the solute concentration in the filtrate in the distal convoluted tubule. If there's a high level of solutes, then antidiuretic hormone is released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, thus causing a retention of more water to reduce that high solute concentration in the blood. The blood plasma is usually maintained at 300 milliosmoles. So if there's more solutes than and the osmolarity rises above 300, then ADH is released, synthesized in the hypothalamus and exported down to the posterior lobe, and released from the posterior lobe, thus preserving water, holding back in water, and diluting that too high osmolarity. Similarly, and vice versa, with low solute concentrations, ADH is not released, and therefore more water is lost and the solute concentration rises back into the normal range. An important effect of an external stimulant is the effect of alcohol. Alcohol is commonly consumed. Alcohol has a diuretic effect. It causes a loss of water, and the reason it does is because it inhibits antidiuretic hormone release and causes, therefore, a large increase in the volume of urine output. Okay, so if we move on now to the thyroid gland, this is the largest endocrine gland in the body. It's located in the on the anterior aspect of the neck. There's two lateral lobes connected by tissue called the isthmus right in between. That's not so important, but there are two lobes, fairly large lobes in the neck. And inside the tissue you have follicles that produce a glycoprotein called thyroglobulin. Okay, I remind you, a glycoprotein is a molecule that's part carbohydrate, part protein. So in the thyroid gland, it's produced, it's called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin has the ability to bind up iodine. It has a very high affinity for iodine. And the thyroglobulin with the iodine is called colloid, and it fills the space inside the follicles of the thyroid gland. This colloid substance is a precursor for thyroid hormone itself. There are other cells within the thyroid gland, and I'll explain to you with the diagram where they are with the on the following slides. And those other cells are called parafollicular cells, and they produce a different hormone called calcitonin that's involved in regulation of calcium levels in the body. So here you see the neck, some of the internal organs in this diagram of the neck. That's the larynx in this area here, and there's the trachea down here. You can see some of the trachea, and the thyroid gland is this organ structure here. That's one lobe, and there's the other lobe right there. Now the tissue itself looks like what's shown here on the right hand side. What you have are these round structures called follicles. You have many follicles in the thyroid gland, and inside the follicle it's filled with this substance here, this pink amorphous substance filling the space there, which is called colloid. And the follicle cells are what produce that material. It's thyroglobulin plus iodine, and that is what's used to form thyroid hormone. Now, in between these, right in between at the junctions between these follicles is where you have the, just a second here, is where you have the parafollicular cells. So right in the junctions, and I'll mark them out in these areas, like in here or in here or here, you know, right where the follicles meet in these junctional areas, you have parafollicular cells, and they're the ones that produce the hormone calcitonin. Okay, so the thyroid hormone is made up of two, they're called T3 and T4. T3 stands for triiodothyronine and T4 stands for thyroxine. It's okay to call them T3 or T4. T4 has 4 bound iodine molecules, or bound to the thyroglobulin, and or bound to the rest of the molecule. And T3 has 3 iodine molecules or atoms. So the hormone is T3 and T4. The hormone, and it falls under a general term, just thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is involved in the oxidation of glucose. Remember, the oxidation of glucose or breakdown of glucose is used to generate energy. So energy gets produced by that process in cells, and one of the byproducts besides energy is that CO2 is released. Okay, and you know, it has a lot to do with the rate of breakdown or oxidation of glucose, and so therefore it's involved also in increasing the metabolic rate and resulting in some increase in heat production in the body. It also plays a role in maintaining blood pressure, regulating some tissue growth, development of skeletal and nervous system, and maturation, reproductive capabilities. Quite a few large areas. It's not solely involved, but has an influence. Certainly thyroid hormone, an excess amount of thyroid hormone will cause a rise in blood pressure, because it does have an effect on the heart rate. It causes an increase in heart rate if you have excessive amounts. The main functions, however, are these metabolic functions here of maintaining the appropriate amounts of thyroid hormone will maintain appropriate levels of metabolic activity. Excess, you'll get excess metabolic activity, and if you have a deficit of thyroid hormone, you'll have a lower, in fact, too low metabolic activity in your cells. Here's a diagram that goes through the whole synthesis process, resulting in the end in T3 and T4 production and release. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but generally it's a production of thyroglobulin and binding of iodine to that thyroglobulin, and then it goes through a synthesis process resulting in T3 and T4 production and release into the bloodstream. The thyroid hormone itself, T3 and T4, as I've mentioned, actually in previous video lecture, is bound to plasma proteins. So there are carrier proteins in the plasma. It's called TBG, or thyroxine binding globulin. Happens to be produced in the liver. These will help carry T3 and T4 through the bloodstream. The difference between T3 and T4, a major difference, is the ability to bind to specific target receptors on cells. T3, well, they both bind, but T3 is 10 times more active than T4. Okay, so T3 is the much more active molecule than T4. The tissues in general have the receptors and will the hormone itself acts sort of in a similar way to steroids that can increase metabolic activity also. It's all governed by a negative feedback mechanism in which the hypothalamus produces, when appropriate, a thyrotropin releasing hormone. So there's a releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus that then goes on to trigger thyroid stimulating hormone production and release from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Okay, in terms of the parafollicular cells at the junctions between the follicular cells, where those round structures made up of follicular cells around the follicles, you have in the junctions, you have parafollicular cells. And they're also called not just parafollicular cells, but sometimes C cells. They will produce a protein or peptide hormone, which is called calcitonin. It acts in the opposite action or reaction to parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone is involved in raising calcium levels, and calcitonin is involved in lowering calcium channels, or levels rather, particularly in children. It targets the skeleton. Calcitonin will target the skeleton and will inhibit osteoclast activity. I remind you, osteoclasts are found in the bones, and they eat away at the bone during bone remodeling. So there's less bone resorption, less release of calcium. It will inhibit release of calcium, therefore, from that bone matrix. It also stimulates calcium uptake into bone matrix. So you have more uptake of calcium into the bone, you have less release of calcium from the bone, less activity of osteoclasts, therefore less free calcium available to float around in the bloodstream. Again, it's regulated by a negative feedback mechanism, and will be produced if calcium levels rise too high in the blood plasma. Okay, let's move on and talk about the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands are located posterior to the thyroid gland. So there's one lobe of the thyroid there, and there's the other lobe. This is a posterior view, and you can see the parathyroid glands. There are 4 of them. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the parathyroid glands. They regulate calcium levels. They will be released if calcium levels they regulate calcium levels in the blood plasma. They'll be released if those levels get too low. And the cells inside them that secrete the parathyroid hormone are called chief cells. This is what make up most of the parathyroid gland. The effect that they have is, as I said, it'll be released with low levels of calcium, and they can raise the level by stimulating osteoclast activity, which breaks down bone material, bone matrix. So osteoclasts are stimulated. It will also enhance reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys. It does have an effect. Often phosphate and calcium go in opposite directions. So with enhanced calcium reabsorption, you get increased secretion of phosphate. But the main thing is increased availability by osteoclast activity. So there's more calcium available from the skeleton, from the bones, and more calcium getting reabsorbed in the kidneys, and also more absorption of calcium from food material in the gastrointestinal tract. All of this results in an increase in the calcium levels in the plasma, and once those levels rise high enough, then it's a negative feedback mechanism resulting in the inhibition of parathyroid hormone release. So it's, when calcium is low, you get more parathyroid released, and you get higher calcium levels. And when they reach a high enough level, then you get inhibition of the parathyroid hormone, and it drops back down. So you have a stable, hopefully, oscillation around a proper normal level of calcium, all regulated mostly by parathyroid hormone rather than calcitonin. And here you see that kind of activity, the activity of parathyroid hormone on the osteoclasts, making more calcium available, and the increased absorption of calcium from food, again, making calcium more available. And also the increase in calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay, let's move on to a fairly larger topic because of the number of hormones involved, and that is the topic of the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit on top of each of the kidneys, so there's two of them, and they are both structurally and functionally actually two glands in one. The outer part is called the cortex, the adrenal cortex, and the inner part is called the adrenal medulla. And the outer part is made up of glandular type of tissue, which is secretory and secretes hormones. And the inner part is made up of nerve tissue that acts as a part of the sympathetic nervous system. And that part can secrete catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine, into the bloodstream. Now the outer part, or cortex, releases steroid hormones, and collectively those hormones are called corticosteroids. So that term that you hear, corticosteroids, actually refers to a set of different hormones produced by different layers of tissues within the adrenal cortex. And in fact, there are three layers of tissues, quite distinct from each other. And they are, in order, zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. So that's, if it helps, GFR. Okay. Now that first layer, the products of that first layer, the zona glomerulosa, are termed mineralocorticoids, and the main hormone that's produced there is aldosterone. The second layer, zona fasciculata, produces what are collectively called glucocorticoids, and the main one being produced is called cortisol. And the third layer, the zona reticularis, produces gonadotropins, and the main ones are androgens. So here you see it, and it's going from the outside in. So this is this tissue out here is the connective tissue capsule that forms the surface of the adrenal gland. And the first zone is the zona glomerulosa, and the next one is the zona fasciculata, and the next one is the zona reticularis. So G, F, and R, and that collectively, those three make up the cortex of the adrenal gland, so the adrenal cortex, and then below that, towards the center, is the adrenal medulla in there. So you can see that in this drawing that this layer and this layer and the third layer are histologically quite distinct from each other, and their products are quite different from each other. In the zona glomerulosa, the mineralocorticoids, the main one is aldosterone. These regulate electrolyte concentrations in the extracellular fluid. And as you know, that needs to be maintained, and it's a delicate balance. It needs to be maintained around 300 milliosmoles. So, and the main one that it's controlling, because it's the most important electrolyte, is sodium. Now, aldosterone, which we have talked about before when we were doing renal physiology, acts by reducing excretion of sodium, increasing reabsorption, in other words. Okay, so sodium that gets into the filtrate will be reabsorbed to a greater degree when aldosterone is secreted. And of course, with the reabsorption of sodium, you also get reabsorption of some water, and so that tends to increase the fluid volume, and therefore in the vasculature, and therefore the blood pressure. The mineralocorticoids aldosterone can be stimulated in a number of ways, one of which we talked about before, which is the renin-angiotensin mechanism or pathway. But the other thing that will directly stimulate is either a rising level of potassium or a low level of sodium. So changes in either of these ions, high potassium or low sodium, can cause aldosterone to be secreted, or a drop in blood volume or blood pressure can also, and therefore if blood volume goes down, then the pressure goes down. That'll also cause aldosterone to be secreted. So actually you have those three ways: through the renin-angiotensin system, directly through either rising potassium or lowering sodium, or through a drop in blood pressure. Here we have 4. It says 4, but I should point out that the fourth one is an inhibition of aldosterone release, and that's mediated by atrial natriuretic peptide, which to a large extent does the opposite of aldosterone. Instead of causing sodium reabsorption, it causes increased sodium excretion in the urine. So it's natriuresis. Natriuresis means an increase in sodium loss. Just like diuresis means an increase in loss of water, then natriuresis, which comes from the term natrium, which is natrium is another name for sodium. That's why it's Na for natrium. That's why it's called Na for natrium. So natriuresis is the loss. Atrial natriuretic peptide released in the walls from the walls of the atrium of the heart will inhibit aldosterone release. These other three, which I've already gone through and mentioned, will increase aldosterone release. Actually, I didn't mention this one, I'm sorry. So the renin-angiotensin system, plasma concentrations of sodium, low sodium or high potassium will also increase aldosterone. ACTH has some effect. ACTH is produced during stress, and that will also cause some increase of aldosterone. And then, of course, the last one that I mentioned before, which was a drop in blood pressure. And that should be on this slide. I'm not sure why it's not. So renin-angiotensin, plasma concentrations of sodium, potassium, low sodium, high potassium, drop in blood pressure, or ACTH, are all mechanisms that upregulate aldosterone secretion. And ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide presence or release, will inhibit aldosterone release. And here this is summarized in this diagram where you have the different pathways. I'm not sure that renin-angiotensin, oh yes it is. So renin released from the kidneys, causing, of course, splitting of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and then angiotensin 1 gets split into angiotensin 2 by the action of in the lungs of angiotensin converting enzyme, and angiotensin 2 will trigger aldosterone release. The other thing is low sodium or high potassium will directly trigger aldosterone release. And then ACTH can trigger aldosterone release, and increased a drop in blood pressure rather, and that's through here, that will also cause aldosterone release. And in terms of inhibitory effects, the increase in blood pressure will trigger ANP release from the atrium of the heart, and that inhibits. So this pathway here is an inhibitory pathway that inhibits aldosterone. So the next layer, zona fasciculata, produces glucocorticoids, and the main one is cortisol. And cortisol is mainly released in response to stress. It helps the body to resist the effects of stress, helps keep blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels relatively constant, helps maintain blood volume, prevents water shift into the tissues. It also it helps to increase blood glucose levels by stimulating a process called gluconeogenesis in the cells. This is the formation of, and we did cover this last semester, this is the formation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. And these would typically be protein or lipid, fat. So, and it also will directly help increase glucose, the cortisol that is, will help directly increase glucose and fatty acid, amino acid in the bloodstream, in the blood plasma. If you have excess levels of glucocorticoid release of cortisol, that's a problem because it can have a inhibitory effect on cartilage and bone formation. The nice thing about it is, however, that it does inhibit inflammation, and this is why it's used quite often in inflammatory diseases. People receive injections of glucocorticoids or use glucocorticoids on their skin, for example, if they have an inflammatory process going on. In joints, it's used often. If a person has a joint that's inflamed and very painful for a long time, then sometimes they will receive an injection directly into the joint of glucocorticoid, cortisol, which is good because it acts very well for decreasing the inflammatory response. However, the problem is you can't do it too often. You can't have repeated injections into the joint because it will prevent cartilage and bone formation. So it inhibits repair processes that hopefully are occurring. It will depress the immune system, and so often people who have autoimmune diseases receive this therapeutically, glucocorticoids therapeutically. And it has other functions which are, this is pretty vague, the last lines. I'm going to just leave that out. So excess levels and, treatment with corticosteroids is the application of higher levels, excess levels of corticoids, can have positive effects on inflammation and can reduce autoimmune disease because it depresses the immune system. However, in joints, it's used with caution because it can depress cartilage and bone formation. Okay, the last or third layer of the zona of the adrenal cortex that I'm going to talk about is the zona reticularis, which mostly produces androgens. The products of this zone are called gonadocorticoids, and most of that is androgens. The most important androgen is testosterone. Okay, and testosterone is produced at higher levels in males than females, but it has just as important role it has a very important role in both genders, both male and female. It contributes to, and other androgens, but testosterone primarily, it contributes to the onset of puberty. It contributes to the appearance of secondary sexual characteristics, and I'm not sure why I left out males, but contributes to sex drive in males and females. After menopause, androgens will often be converted in the body into estrogens. I don't know how important that is, but certainly androgens are quite important in terms of sexual onset, sexual morphological characteristics, and sex drive. Okay, so that was the three layers of the cortex producing mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids. In the inner portion of the adrenal gland, in the adrenal medulla, you have nervous tissue or nerve tissue, and there are cells in there called chromaffin cells that will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, also called adrenaline and noradrenaline. And secretion of these into the bloodstream spreads them all over and triggers all of the kind of typical responses that you would get with output from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So this is a sympathetic neurotransmitter, actually, and there's no difference except that it's systemic, spread all through the body. You'll get the same effects as you would if you had direct sympathetic when you have stimulation, direct sympathetic innervation into an organ. But when it's spread all over, you can see a rise in glucose levels. You get a generalized vasoconstriction. Of course, you get a increase in the heart rate. More blood gets diverted to the key core organs, brain, heart, and also to skeletal muscle. So there's vasodilation leading on the arterial vessels leading to the brain, and also in the heart and skeletal muscle. So you get a big, systemic sympathetic boost when release of these kind of neurotransmitters directly into the bloodstream, into the blood plasma, occurs from the adrenal medulla. Of the two, adrenaline or epinephrine versus noradrenaline, norepinephrine. Epinephrine is a much more potent stimulator of heart and metabolic activity, whereas norepinephrine has a major influence more on the peripheral vasculature in terms of vasoconstriction and also, therefore, blood pressure, because with increased vasoconstriction, you get increases in blood pressure. Okay, let's talk a little bit about stress and the adrenal gland. The stimulus of stress, and it can be all kinds of things that can cause an increase in stress, leads to release from the hypothalamus of corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. And of course, CRH will act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary to trigger ACTH release. So ACTH goes into the blood plasma from the anterior lobe of the pituitary and will target the adrenal cortex to release both mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. And therefore the long-term stress response, this is with prolonged stress. So long-term stress response is retention of more sodium and water by the kidneys due to the aldosterone in the mineralocorticoids, therefore increase in blood volume and blood pressure. So long-term stressful experience of stress can cause an increase in high blood pressure, an increase in pressure. At the same time, the glucocorticoids that get released will increase glucose availability and therefore blood sugar, and tend to suppress the immune system, which is why sometimes with stress people are more somewhat immunosuppressed, more susceptible to infection. Short-term stress is a direct stimulator of the sympathetic pathways and will cause direct activation into the adrenal medulla, triggering catecholamine release from the adrenal medulla. And so you get this typical kind of sympathetic response of increased heart rate, higher blood pressure, more glucose available, bronchodilation, blood flow patterns change, less to the gut, more and less to the urine, more to the heart, the brain, the muscles, and an increased metabolic rate. That's short term, very short term. That's a typical, very short, quick, almost instantaneous response to some sort of stress stimuli that a person is receiving. Whereas on the right-hand side, these are all due to more prolonged kind of stresses. And stress is a very vague general term. It can be due to lack of food, or lack of warmth, or lack of shelter, lack of more exposure to the environment. It could be psychological stress from other people around you continuing for a more prolonged period of time. You will get ACTH affecting the adrenal cortex and causing a higher level of mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoid release and the associated long-term effects of stress. Okay, I think that would be a good place to stop. So we'll continue after this. This is the end of Unit 4B, Part 1.